Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short,
and of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on the Bear Market Brief.
Last time we checked in on the vibe in Kyiv and Ukraine more broadly, I made an embarrassing mistake. I told our guest that since it had been a year, it was worth a check-in. He corrected me and said actually it had been half a year. Just goes to show my warped sense of time these days. But do you know what's more embarrassing than that? Doing the same thing 2 editions in a row. Once again, thought it had been 6 months when it has in fact been very nearly a year. But regardless of how long it's actually been, the time is nigh for another Kyiv Dispatch. I'm Aaron Schwartzbaum. I promise I know what month it is, and this is the Bear Market Brief, a podcast about the intersection of politics, economics, and security in Russia, Ukraine, and beyond. Now, I enjoy all of my conversations here on The Brief, but I really enjoy this mini-series in particular because it's focused on the lived reality of the war. We'll certainly talk a little bit about the back and forth on the front, but this is really focused on the experience of people and how events relating to the war and politics more broadly impact them. If you're following events in Ukraine from sort of a distance, this is a great episode for you because I take that vantage point as I ask our guests questions. I heard that this thing happened. Is that really the case? What's going on? Our guest this episode and longtime friend and contributor to the Bear Market Brief is Fabrice Deprez. Fabrice is a French journalist based in Kyiv, currently working as a Ukraine reporter with the Financial Times, while also freelancing with several French and English publications. Once again, this is the Kyiv Dispatch. Fabrice, good to have you for another Kyiv Dispatch. How have you been?
Hi, Aaron. Thanks. It's good to be back. I've been pretty good. I just got back this morning from Kramatorsk in eastern Ukraine. So I'm currently in Kyiv, where it is a very, very nice day, mostly quiet. So I've been good.
Good to hear. Good to hear you're safe too. Let's start with the high level, not very technical question here. The general vibe check. So I think we spoke about half a year ago, seems to be the cadence we're doing these updates. And last time we spoke, you had just visited the city of Pokrovsk, which is a rail hub, important strategic aim for Russia and eastern Ukraine. Last we spoke, you said that the city, the people who remained in the city, many had evacuated, were digging in and preparing for what seems like an inevitable conquest and probably the outright destruction of the city. Looks like that hasn't happened yet. So I don't want to make this about like military tactics, but where do we stand on the front? Let's start with the military update. Doesn't seem like things have changed dramatically.
So on the military front, I think it was about closer to a year ago because it was almost exactly a year ago that the Russian forces kind of made a pretty significant advance and reached a few kilometers away from Pokrovsk, which is sort of when the Battle of Pokrovsk started. And yeah, since we've seen rather than the kind of Bakhmut style, street by street fighting, we've seen Russian forces try to surround the city, which they have partly achieved, though there is still logistical lines into the city. So Ukraine forces are still definitely present in the city. And in fact, there has been some Russian attempts to kind of infiltrate the city and have forces fighting in there, which as of right now, it seems have been repelled by Ukraine forces. So yes, we still haven't really seen the kind of fighting that we have seen and the kind of destruction that we have seen, in Bakhmut and in, unfortunately, many other Ukraine cities, which is, probably in good part because of battles like the Battle of Bakhmut, where Russia has seen like how costly those can be, and that it can be simply easier and less deadly to just surround the place, cut the logistical line, and force a Ukraine retreat, which has not happened so far. But I do think, in any case, when this battle started a year ago, at least most analysts, most experts I was talking to at the time, didn't expect Pokrov to fall quickly. They did expect Pokrov to fall, and I think now that the feeling is that that's still likely going to happen in the coming month. But they didn't expect it to happen quickly, just based on the track record of other battles. Just recently, the Russian forces were able to take Chasiv, not far from the kind of de facto capital of Kramatorsk, and that took more than a year. That took 15 months for a fairly small city. So the pattern has been very slow advances on the Russian side. But on the other end, to kind of take a step back, things have been fairly dynamic right now on the front. There was recently a very significant Russian advance north of Pokrovsk, which Ukraine command had to scramble a lot of force in order to contain, and were able to contain and even counterattack and take back some territories. There have been other Russian advances in several other parts of the front line, counterattacks by Ukraine forces in several other parts of the front line, which I think is, in good part at least, an indication of now how porous the front line has become. You have less forces manning the actual front line, and a lot more drone being active. So you have kind of more space to bypass units, which Russian forces have been exploiting. And so you have those kind of battles happening a little bit everywhere, and the kind of the concept itself of front line is becoming less and less clear, because it's more now about many small positions which are being held, and sometimes kind of Russian and Ukraine positions very close to each other. You have the gray zone has expanded, basically.
Oh, interesting. And good update. And the reminder, I think last time we had one of these conversations, I had also completely mistaken how short or long ago we had talked last, which just goes to show the listeners my sense of time has completely eroded with everything happening in the world and in life. So we have the more military update. I guess the question more broadly, zooming out beyond the military question, I guess there's one quasi-military question. So like the porous front line, the thing I've read and wanted to ask you about is that Ukraine's biggest problem isn't even technical equipment. I know Ukraine has built cruise missiles. They're more able to attack Russia, have been, I think, attacking a lot of oil refineries of late to some effect. But the issue still seems to be around manpower and an unwillingness of Ukrainian leadership to launch a draft of younger men. Is that the case? Is that true? And do you see that changing? I know that's been kind of a political will they, won't they, hot button issue.
In my opinion, I don't even think it's a will they, won't they issue. It seems pretty clear that the Ukraine leadership has no intention or doesn't feel that it can afford politically to have any significant increase in mobilization. That's been now established, and there has been no indication that Zelensky or the top leadership might change tack on this. We're still in a situation where, of course, the numbers are not official, but where Ukraine is mobilizing, around 20,000, maybe 24,000 people every month. That seems to be the current rhythm. And for now, that is likely going to remain. From what I understand from experts, it's not enough to replenish forces. It's been a problem for a very long time, and I think it's clear for everyone that some of the Russian advance are, at least in part, it's of course never the one reason, there's always a whole bunch of reasons, but at least in part explained by this issue where, you have frontline brigades which are only going to be staffed at 30, 50, maybe 60% of their official amount of forces that they're supposed to have, with obvious issues, and with also the issue of having troops that are still left that are a lot more exhausted. That's part of the problem. Ukraine is trying to counter that, I think, mostly now with technology, and which is for now is working. I think it's pretty clear that that they are able to still use drones to kind of effectively repel most Russian advance. But then again, you see those kind of constant small crises that kind of pop up all the time on the front line, and which require Ukraine command to take, the more battle experienced units and transfer them to that hot point and then to another area. And I think it's pretty clear that the Russian strategy is to try to multiply those crises in the hope that at some point something will break, and that at some point Ukraine forces won't be able to contain one of those crises. So far, that hasn't happened, and there's also the bigger issue of, if that happened, would Russian forces be able to actually exploit such a situation and to actually, launch armored units in it to actually advance more than the couple hundred meters or couple of kilometers that they've had for now? And that doesn't seem clear to me at all. It is clear that manpower has been an issue now for, at least 2 years, and is remaining an issue.
Yeah, fair enough. And, I feel like a lot of these podcasts, like we said, we're going to talk about society as a whole and then inevitably become like military questions. What's happening? What's not happening? So I want to make sure we're actually focusing on the people involved here. So we talked about the front specifically. We talked about manpower more broadly. Zooming out to our highest level yet, how are people feeling, in Kyiv, the mood broadly? And then you also visited the quote-unquote frontline capital, Kramatorsk. How are people feeling there? What is your sense of the national mood these days? Has it changed since last time?
I think it has changed. You have basically, I think now the main feature is definitely exhaustion. People, that was still the case a year ago. You had people who were extremely exhausted. It is very much the case now. And you can see now more often people who are going to sort of try to become more detached from the war, trying to sort of ignore it as much as possible, basically as a way to preserve themselves. When you've lived in a situation like that for 3 years, at some point it's becoming more common to see people just try to ignore the news, try to kind of live their life as much as possible. You have exhaustion, and you still have that resilience that I think is, at least in part, due to still the general feeling that there is simply no alternative, that, Russia has no intention of stopping, that there isn't right now any way out that would allow Ukraine to maintain its sovereignty, and that therefore there is just no other choice but to keep going. So you have this adaptation, this exhaustion that is very clear, and something that I've also heard, especially now in Kramatorsk, and maybe we'll talk about that, the more diplomatic angle and this Russian demand of giving up Donbass in exchange maybe for a ceasefire. What I've heard also as an answer several times is, to say we've had so many people who have died already, and so we can't just give them territory now. That would be basically like spitting in the face of all the people who have already died in the past 3 years. So you have this kind of conscious of the toll that the war has already taken. And that is something that I've heard before, but now it's especially stark, in my opinion.
I like to follow public opinion data broadly in the world as a whole. I've seen conflicting reports about the readiness of Ukraine's population for peace. And it seems like what I've seen in some of the public opinion surveys has been that people obviously want peace. It seems like are more favorable towards having negotiations, but broadly are not willing, kind of touching on what you just said, not willing to make territorial concessions for obvious reasons. The current's toll, what it means for people stuck behind Russian lines. Is my understanding accurate? Have you seen a change in kind of thoughts about like how the war might end, or is it this fatigue with the digging in, as you kind of mentioned?
Yes, I think that's fairly accurate overall. Yes, the polls are sometimes confusing because I think people themselves are very uncertain about this issue. So I think in many cases it is difficult for people themselves to give a clear answer, which means that the answers are going to depend a lot on how the question is asked, which means that, yeah, you can clearly put some polls side by side and they seem to be giving completely different answer. And you even have, the same poll sometimes where the answers seem to be the same, but I think has changed. To me, the most typical example is the question about whether Ukrainians believe that they can still win the war. And there was a very recent poll made about that came out just a few days ago, and where I don't have the exact number in mind, but basically the answer of whether Ukrainians believe that they could win the war went from something like 80, maybe even 90% in June 22 to about 50% now. Which, if you look at the data like this, you'll be like, okay, it went down, obviously, but it's still a majority. But to me, I think it's also clear that the meaning of what it means to win the war has changed. That, in 2022, for a lot of people, winning the war was, at the very least, get back all the territories lost since the beginning of the Russian invasion. Maybe getting back all the territory since 2014, and maybe even going back to the 1991 border, meaning including Crimea. Now, I think for a lot more people, winning the war is more about maintaining sovereignty. I think most people have accepted that there isn't, the Ukraine military is not going to get back those territories anytime soon, if ever. So the meaning has changed in itself. But that being said, to go back to the question of territorial concession, I think, yes, you have still people still do not want a peace that would involve full capitulation and a loss of sovereignty. I think people still want, those security guarantees. This concept of security guarantees matters a lot for most Ukrainians. I think not just for sort of patriotic reasons, though that's part of it, but it's also about, for most people, it's also about the uncertainty that they live in now and the ability to get back some possibility of planning for the future. That right now you are thinking in terms of the next few months, maybe the following year. But if it comes to, buying a house, sending your kids to school, to university, there is this constant uncertainty. And if you get just a ceasefire with the fear that the war could restart in the next 6 months, then you haven't gotten rid of that uncertainty. So I think for most people, that's why it matters so much. They want to get back this ability to plan for the future, basically to live normally again, which for them, and I think that's probably accurate, could only happen if they actually get security guarantee and therefore the near certainty that the war will not start again.
Yeah, it makes sense from a human level, basic perspective here. So we've started talking a little bit about diplomacy, and it has been a busy month on the diplomatic front. We had Putin and Trump met in Alaska. Unclear whether that actually moved the ball at all. We then had some shuttle diplomacy. Zelensky came back to Washington along with the European leaders. Zelensky didn't get yelled at this time, so changes here. Do you think that this diplomacy has actually changed anything materially? It doesn't seem like there's been measurable progress, but sometimes when these peace negotiations happen, you don't hear about any concrete moves until the announcement at the end. And then as a follow-up question, talking to Ukrainian locals, both elite and regular folks, what's their read on what's going on?
So to start with your second question first, I think there is the first reaction probably after the Alaska meeting, and especially after the Zelensky-Trump meeting in the White House, was, I think, mostly relief that they hadn't been a repeat of the kind of February disaster when Zelensky was basically yelled at by Vance, and that there wasn't any major announcement like stopping all support for Ukraine or something like that. There was still a lot of worry because I think it's important to point out that for a lot of Ukrainian, Trump's arrival in the White House was actually a major source of hope. There were genuinely a lot of people in Ukraine who were sincerely hoped that Trump was going to push for negotiation, and that those negotiations would be successful, and that there would be some kind of cessation of hostility. That was a general palpable hope in Ukraine. That was, of course, that was followed by a very major disappointment. But then when there started being this talk about Russia asking for Donetsk and Lugansk region to be given in exchange for a ceasefire, that was a big source of anxiety as well. So overall, I think most people's reaction, both in the population and among the elite, by the way, was to say that it could have been a lot worse. This diplomatic process could have been a lot worse. Overall, now I don't think we can say that the needle has moved much. From the Ukraine point of view, it is a success that the conversation about security guarantee has become a lot more intense and a lot more practical. That there is actual discussion about how could this happen. And of course, for Ukraine leadership, it's also super important that was maybe for them the biggest success, that Trump and the US said that they would be ready to be involved in some way, maybe not at the forefront, but that they would be ready to take part in some way in those security guarantees. But now we're still at the, how would that work exactly? And here there is a lot of discussion about it, but I think nothing concrete.
Let's turn to our penultimate question here. To editorialize for a second, one of my big pet peeves around conversations about Ukraine is this canard coming in part from folks, more populist wings who don't support for Ukraine. They say, well, Ukraine has a corruption problem. And that rubs me the wrong way because Ukrainians know that. It's been a topic and a struggle for some time. There's a lot of civil society arrayed to make this better. This is an ongoing fight. And I think this came to a head recently. There's an organization, NABU, which if you're a Star Wars fan is a little funny, but it's the Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine that came into being, as I recall, after the Maidan uprising, kind of an independent wing of government that has broad leeway to go after corruption without political control. And as best I understand, there was an effort put forward by Zelensky's party, Servant of the People, to basically neuter the organization, make it subject to political control. And then protests broke out, after which the government backed off from that. So this seems like a moment kind of reminiscent of politics prior to this latest episode of Russian invasion. What happened here? Why did this initiative even come up to begin with? What are the kind of broader forces at play that would want to move the needle there? And then tell me about what you saw with how people mobilize. Seeing a protest is pretty unusual over the last couple of years for obvious reasons.
Yes, it was very, very unusual. The past 3 years, you did have a few what you might call protests, but there were more usually you have regular gathering, for example, calling for liberation of prisoners of war, Ukraine prisoners of war held in Russia, or from families of soldiers who have been missing in action, asking for information about it. You also had especially in the first year, you had protests asking for money from the city budget to be sent to the army. These were kind of small gathering and not anti-government. So yes, that was very, very unusual. It felt very much like going back in the kind of pre-Russian invasion era in terms of the general vibe, the general feeling, with the difference that we had a crowd that was a lot younger and with a lot more women, I would say, than the typical protest that you had before the invasion. That was very, very striking. But yeah, there was a very strong and quick mobilization. It really came extremely quickly. Why did this happen? Why did the government at large, the leadership at large, try to get rid basically of the independence of the NABU? That's still sort of unclear. I think the main, the main theory now is that the NABU was so running several investigations, several of which were kind of targeting figures close to Zelensky and close to people close to Zelensky, which therefore would have triggered this kind of attempt. Some Ukrainians joked that it was this special operation because it happened extremely quickly, where there was a bunch of searches by the Ukraine Security Service, and immediately after there was this bill that was rushed through the parliament to put the NABU, basically, I'm summing up here, but basically to put the NABU under control of the general prosecutor. So that was done in literally a day, which immediately triggered those protests. And I think here you can see that Zelensky clearly misread the situation, or at least someone around Zelensky clearly misread the situation, probably thought that, with the war and everything, people wouldn't care about that. And they were wrong, and I do think they were wrong specifically because of the war, and because in that situation, NABU is one of the few very concrete achievements of the Maidan. It's a very specific, well-recognized institution, which actually does enjoy some measure of respect in the Ukraine public, in a situation where most state institutions do not enjoy any of that respect. And so the prospect of having that achievement from the Maidan Revolution being stripped away now in this situation was obviously unacceptable for a lot of Ukrainians, which I think explained this really, really quick and really strong mobilization.
Maybe it relates to what you said before. People feel like a very high cost has been paid, and there's a resistance to roll back those achievements. Last question, and always my favorite question to ask on these. You've talked to a lot of people, seen a lot of places. I guess it hasn't been 6 months, it's been a year, but any anecdotes, conversations, colorful moments that stand out to you that you would like to share with the listening public to this episode?
So I think one of the recent story that I've heard and that kind of stuck to my mind, because I think it represents pretty well what's going on. I was in Poltava last month, which is this city in eastern Ukraine, but kind of now it's very much a logistical hub city, because when you're in Poltava, you are not very far from Kharkiv. You're also not very far, probably more or less the same distance from the Donbass. So if you want to drive to Kharkiv, you'll go through Poltava usually. And I was having this discussion with a local journalist who was telling me of his experience a few weeks prior to that, when Russian drones hit a military building right in central Poltava, and there was the TTSK, so the sort of mobilization office of the city of Poltava. And he was telling me about how he was going to work with his headphones on, and his office was basically a couple hundred meters from the building that was hit by at least 3 drones. I think you have footage showing the drones just diving into the building. And so he was walking in the streets, heard one major explosion, and kind of looked around him and saw basically everyone just ignoring the explosion, which again was a couple hundred meters away, so fairly loud. And you have this kind of general indifference to the explosion. And he told me about going to his office and started, opening a Word file and kind of typing an explosion heard in central Poltava, and then suddenly hearing 2-3 more explosion, and going backspace on his Word file, and instead of one explosion, typing several explosions were heard in Poltava, and just having this kind of routine where you have this mix of indifference and also at the same time, and sometimes in the same place, and sometimes among the same people, where you'll also have this kind of instant moment of fear, is, I think, very representative of what's going on in Ukraine right now.
What a colorful moment! Thank you for sharing and for coming back for the latest Kyiv Dispatch. Thank you so much, Fabrice.
My pleasure.
Thanks again to Fabrice and to you, listener, for joining. Be sure to follow along with the Bear Market Brief at the Twitter and/or X handle @BearMarketBrief. Bear Market Brief is brought to you by the Russia-Eurasia program of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, that is FPRI, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. For more information on this initiative and on many others, visit fpri.org. We'll catch you next time.